welcome back to another episode of Hipster Codes. I wanted to get back into Python a little bit and see if I can switch off between Unreal Engine and Python videos or other sorts of web dev videos as well. And I wanted to deep dive a little bit into building APIs using Flask and using Python. Now, I've done Python videos previously, so I want to come into this video assuming that you have a little bit of knowledge of how to use Python and how to use Python packages, how to use pip, things like that. So if you don't, I have other videos on this channel and my previous channel that might be able to help you get through that. Of course, there's also another million videos on YouTube to at least get you up to speed with making sure that you can create a virtual environment and install packages into that virtual environment. If that's something you would like separate videos on, just leave a comment. Maybe it's something I can get into in the future, but I figured it would help speed up the process here, assuming they have just a little bit of Python knowledge. So here I have a directory that I called Flask app, and we're just going to go over in this video the anatomy of a Flask app. In future videos, I'd like to go over building a full REST API with Flask with various different methods and packages. But before we do that, we'll just create the absolute bare bone skeleton of what it takes to actually run an app. Now, this app today isn't going to return anything special. We're only going to return text. I'll just use Firefox here to be able to see our web page, and we're only going to run it on localhost. So maybe we can go into deploying apps sometime in the future. So inside my directory here, I'm just going to create a file. We can go up here to new file. We can also go into our terminal and we could say touch. I'm just going to call it app.py for the moment. So here in our app.py, we have to do a couple of things. We have to create a couple of components for our Flask app in order to run it. So what we'll want to have to do here in a second is be able to run Flask run down in our terminal. But if we do that at the moment, nothing happens. So we have to install a virtual environment. If you know virtual env, that's my preference. You could also use something like Python 3 or Python-m venv. That's the built-in package in Python to create virtual environments. I'm partial to virtual env. If you don't know what that is, again, leave a comment below and maybe it's something that we can go over further. But this is something that I assume that you have a little bit of background on in Python. So I'm going to activate my virtual environment by going source env/bin/activate. Now I'm on Linux, so I want to say /bin/activate. If you're developing in Windows, sometimes it's /script/activate. And so now we know that we're in our virtual environment because it says env here in our terminal. And so what we want to do is we want to pip install a package. We're just going to pip install Flask, just the absolute basic Flask. Now, I don't have everything set up on this Linux machine, so I'm going to have a couple of messages pop up that I'm just going to X out of. So now that we have Flask installed, we can double check by saying pip freeze, and we can see it installed Flask and it installed a bunch of dependencies for Flask. So these are just friends that Flask has that it needs to run. They're just other packages. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create a Flask object that's going to represent our server in the script that we're about to build. So we have to import Flask. So we're going to say from lowercase f Flask, we want to import uppercase f Flask. Now this is not an error, this is just a warning from Pylance. It doesn't realize that I'm in my virtual environment. It still thinks I'm in my global environment, so it doesn't think I have Flask installed. If you ever get something like this, you can usually ignore it if you know that you're in your virtual environment and you know you have it installed. If you think it's annoying, sometimes VS Code or whatever IDE you're using will automatically detect your environment or give you an option. If it doesn't, you can go down here to the bottom right. This is the environment that it's using. So you can see it's using my global environment, but what I want it to do is use my virtual environment's version of Python. And so I'm gonna open up my virtual environment, and inside, inside bin, you're gonna have all these different files here. I like to use just the default symbolic link file is what it is here, Python. I right click, I go to copy path, and then here, and this is a VS Code thing entirely, so if you're using a different IDE, you have to figure out how to do it for your own IDE. But we'll just do enter interpreter path, we can paste in our path, And look, now what happened is VS Code realized, oh, you're in a different Python environment. This environment has Flask activated, so it's no longer giving me that underline that basically just said I didn't have the module installed, even though I did. So now we are importing the capital F Flask object from Flask, and what we want to do is we want to instantiate it. So we're going to instantiate it like any other class. So we're going to say Flask, we'll instantiate it. Now it wants one argument, and so we're going to give it dunder name, which is essentially the namespace of this current script that we're in. I still have never gotten a good explanation for why it uses this or how it uses this, but this is just what I've always done, is you put dunder name here for Flask. But now we want to be able to use this object because this is the object that we're going to add all of our routes to. We're going to be able to run the server off of. There's a bunch of other functions that we'll be able to call off of this Flask app. So we need to save it to a variable. And this is where you will always see, or almost always see, the variable named app. So we're going to say app equals our Flask class instantiated. We're going to give it dunder name here as the argument. And so now we can go and do a bunch of things with our server. First thing we'll do is we'll just create a route. This is just where we're going to have our server listen to whatever host we're on, slash a certain route, and our route is just going to be the default slash. So anytime that you go to any website, you can go to youtube.com/, it'll hit the YouTube servers at the slash endpoint. Then their servers figure out what to do with that. Of course, you're going to be logged in, so it's going to direct you elsewhere. But we'll just have this default slash here exist. And the way that we're going to do it is we're going to use this app, and we're going to call a .route method on it. But we're not going to do just that. We're going to have it be a decorator. And I'll explain just a little bit why. I'm not going to go super into depth about decorators in this video or how it actually in detail functions under the hood. But you're going to do an @, which is a decorator. And then we're going to say app.route. Now we're going to invoke that, and that takes a couple of different arguments. The first one that's mandatory is going to be a string for the actual route that we're just going to leave as the default slash. Now below this decorator, we're going to create an actual Python function. Now this is the function that's going to be fed into the decorator, and it's essentially going to be called by the server whenever somebody visits the slash route. And so I usually like to call these something that matches whatever my route is called, but since we have just a completely blank route, it's just the default slash endpoint for the website, I'm just going to call it home. I always like that it's just the basic name for your default slash endpoint. And so here we just have our basic Python function now being fed into our Flask app with the decorator app.route. And then the route is going to be the default slash. Now, anytime that whenever we run the server and somebody visits the slash endpoint, this function will be called, which means it needs a return. So every view function within a Flask app that's under an app.route needs to return something. This is the response that the server is going to give back. So the client reaches out to the server does some sort of process, which is where it's going to call this function and other functions as well in order to go and process whatever it needs to from the client. And then it's going to return, and that's going to be the response from the server. So again, you go to YouTube, their servers handle your request, then they give you a response, which is usually like a web page with a bunch of JavaScript and HTML and stuff like that. So here in Flask, we can return a plethora of different things. We can return JSON, which if you're building an API, which is something we'll do in a future video, you could just return pure JSON. You can return HTML. You can return just a regular string. I'm going to return a string because most browsers will interpret a string just as like a paragraph tag or an H1 tag or something in HTML. So we're not going to worry about any of the HTML stuff in this video. We're just going to simply return, and then we can return a string here, and we could just have it be like 42069 no scope Ohio Riz no cap fam. So here we have the string that we want to return. So whenever somebody visits this website, they're going to actually get the string sent to their browser. And this is kind of all we need in order to run our basic Flask app. Now, is it a good website? No. Is it a fun website? No. Is it a website? Technically, yes. We're about ready to have a website be ready to run. Now, we have our file named app.py. If you named your file something different, this next step isn't going to work, and I'll explain why in a minute. But we're going to go down here into the terminal. We have our virtual environment activated where we have Flask installed, and we can just say Flask run. The command Flask run, and this is going to go and run the app within our app.py module. And then you can see we get a bunch of stuff here in the terminal. It says debug mode off. We're going to turn this on in a minute because that actually helps so you can make edits in your scripts and not have to restart your server every time. We get this warning here that basically says, hey, this is a development server. Make sure not to use it in production. You're never going to want to use the actual Flask server itself in a production server. You want to use what they call a WSGI. I use GUnicorn. Also, some people use Nginx. Now, if these terms are completely new to you, it's something that you don't have to worry about at this point in time, unless if you want to get to the point where you're ready to deploy your app. So we'll worry about that in a separate video as well. Then we can see our app is running here on 127.0.0.1, port 5000. 127.0.0.1 is also localhost, so we can actually visit it. I'm going to open up a private window in my Firefox just so I don't accidentally save any, cookies or anything. And so up here we'll go to localhost, and then we'll say port 5000. Again, this could be interchangeable with 127.0.0.1. We're going to visit this website, and look, we get the response, which again is just the text that we responded from the server. If we go and we inspect this, I can't believe I don't have dark mode activated. I'm kind of offended by my own choice here. I haven't set any of the configurations, right? This is sort of a newer Linux build, so nobody judge me, but apparently I don't have dark mode activated. But you can see it just creates a body for the HTML, and this is our browser doing this work for us. It just creates its own HTML tag. It takes that string response and it just sticks it in the body. And so this is just like the equivalent of a paragraph tag or something like that. Now, just to clarify as well, if we wanted to return HTML, you literally can. So we could just say an h1 tag, this exact text. We're going to end our h1 tag. Let's save it. Now you see we saved it. We have to actually stop our server and restart it because we have debug mode off. Now just while I'm at it, let's do Flask run. But before we click enter, we'll do -- debug. And now anytime that we make a change here, so I could put a space here just so we have a change in our script, and we save it, you see our server just stopped and then it reran. And it gives us like all this debugger stuff. I don't use the debugger very often. A lot of people do find it helpful. So if you ever do want to use the debugging tools within Flask itself, you can use this. Sometimes you need this pin in order to drill into the code within the debugger that exists on the browser. I don't use it very often, but I'm sure it's very useful in certain circumstances, or if you get in the habit of using it, I'm sure it's extraordinarily helpful. So now we have this as an h1 tag. So you remember that one before was just the bot inside the body of our HTML. So it's just like a paragraph tag. We're gonna click refresh and look, all of a sudden we have an h1. So it interpreted this string that has this HTML code as HTML itself, which is all you really get whenever you get a response from a server with HTML, is it can interpret it just as a string, just formatted as HTML code that then it can, decode and be able to interpret as to what it wants the website to look like. We could also do JSON, like I mentioned. So I'm just going to briefly show how we could do JSON. So again, JSON are key value pairs, which Python has something called a Python dictionary. So if we wanted to have some sort of a dictionary that we wanted to return, we could let's just take this same string, and then we'll just call it res for result. We can return a dictionary, and we can have the key be res and the value be the string. But we're missing one thing. Now, we can't just return the res, because what we have to do is turn this Python dictionary into JSON, and Flask within the Flask package has something called a just JSONify function that we will import, and we're going to include our res variable inside the function of JSONify, and we're going to return that. So it's going to take this Python dictionary. It can take lists as well, and it'll turn it into JSON and then return that to the user. So now if we save, we go back to our website, we refresh. You see now my Firefox doesn't interpret it as HTML, right? What it interprets it as is as JSON. So you can see here we have res and then our previous, which is still HTML code, which probably I should have changed, but for the purposes of this demonstration, it doesn't really matter. But you can see we can actually return JSON. So eventually I'll show us building a full REST API. We'll begin by turning things into JSON using JSONify, and then eventually, if I get into it in other videos, we'll probably use a different package to do it on our behalf, so we don't have to call this JSONify function all the time. But regardless, this is just the basic outline of a Flask app. You can return anything you want that can be interpreted by a browser, which is going to be HTML, JSON, text. There's probably other options out there that I'm just not thinking of. You can send files. There's a send file function within Flask as well. Now, a couple of notes on this Flask app. If that's all you needed, and you just wanted the basics of the anatomy of a Flask app, you can end the video if you want. We're importing Flask. You have to import the Flask class from the Flask package. You want to instantiate it. This is what you'll always see. You'll see app equals Flask instantiated. And then this is how you create the routes. And so if we wanted other routes, we could say, Ohio Riz, and now we could have that instead. And then instead of just going to the default / we could go to / Ohio Riz. And then you see we get the same response. And then you could have an unlimited amount of these different routes, as long as they don't conflict, obviously, that can exist in your script. And as you build bigger Flask apps, we can go into how you actually want to structure the folders of your app separately as well. But this is just the basic anatomy of the Flask app. Now, if you want to go over a couple of different other ways to run the Flask app, that's what I'm going to do here in just a second. So I'm going to kill the server now with a Control-C. And another way that you can run the server isn't by doing Flask run. You can do that if you want. And if you ever get into production level servers where you use Unicorn, you usually have to be able to do Flask run anyway, because it needs to find this Flask app in order to serve it. But while you're in development, you could do something like Python and then app.py. Now the problem of what just happened is it loaded all this into memory and then it executed the code. However, we're not actually running the server. Whenever you do flask.run, it runs the server on your behalf. So what we could do here is we can say app.run and we can invoke it at the bottom of our script. This is actually going to call this function. Now if we do python app.py again, you can see we actually launch our server. Now debug mode is turned off. We can feed in all sorts of arguments here, like debug equals true. And how did I delete that? Okay. Debug equals true. We can kill the server and start it again. You can see debug is now turned on. We could change the host. We could change the route if we wanted to. We don't really need to do that here in this video. But one thing, if you've been around the Python sphere for a while, that we want to do is we want to put this inside another block of if dunder name double equals as a string dunder main. Now there's plenty of videos that go into depth about what this is and why you want to do it, but essentially what we're doing is preventing this server from accidentally being run if we import something from this app.py into another script or anything like that. So essentially this makes sure that the app.run only runs whenever you run app.py directly, and it's not going to run if you, for some reason, run another script that for some reason is importing something from app.py. So this is just a good best practice in something like this, as you want to protect this with this line of code. And then you can see as we do, let me save it. And then as we go here and we run python app.py again, you can see we're still serving up our app. Now, you could also change the name of this file. So as you create more files, you might not want to call this one app. You might want to call it something like server. Now, I've gotten into the habit of just calling all of my default Flask apps app.py, but I have in the past called them server.py, because in my mind, hey, we have a server here. This server module represents the server as a whole and the server logic, and then we can import stuff into the server, like database objects or whatnot. But if we wanted to do this, we can simply just go python server.py. We can see this runs just the same. However, if we wanted to use our Flask run method, which is what I actually recommend doing going forward, I just want to show different ways that you can actually launch your server, you can see it doesn't run. The reason it doesn't run is by default, whenever you use the Flask run command, it looks for a module or a file called app.py in order to find the Flask app. It also assumes that the name of your app inside your script is app as well. I've never ever named this something different, so if you ever did, you'd probably have to change the way that Flask interprets your Flask app as well. Something I've never needed to do, never looked into. But we could still have this be called server.py, and we could still use flask.run, but what we have to do is we have to do something, I think it says it here. Yeah, you can see it says use flask -- app option. So we could say flask -- app, and then we're going to do a space, and then we're going to type server. This is the name of the module that it wants to interpret as the basic server module for the app, and it's going to look inside that module to find the app variable that's going to be the instantiated Flask server object, which is what we have here. And so we do flask -- app server. This is the argument being, or the option being fed into, no, I guess it's the argument being fed into the app option is the right way to say it. I'm probably missaying that, but it doesn't really matter because we just do run after that. And look, our server Flask app is serving up the file or the module as server. And we could do anything we wanted from this. Like we could also do -- debug, right? So I always have debug on anytime I'm in development. I always recommend having it on. I really don't know why you would never have it on, honestly, because you can always kill the server if you ever don't want to for some reason. If you ever don't want it to accidentally, restart or something like that. So I always have this turned on just because I don't see any benefit in not having it turned on. So now we have this. You could also do one more thing. You could actually export an environment variable called Flask app, and then we can have the SQL server. And now you can see we can just do Flask run. And I'm going to do debug, but I'm not going to do -- app. You can see it's still serving up the server module as well. Now, the downside of this is now that I've changed this, if I ever wanted to change this file back to app.py, all of a sudden we can't do Flask run. Right, so now we have to go through the whole process again where we say, export Flask app equals app, and that just changes it back to the default that it originally was. But so anyway, that's the anatomy of a Flask app. Eventually I would like to go into building out a full REST API where you can actually go and get data from the database, insert it back to the database, stuff like that. There are a lot of videos out there, but some of them I don't think are always explained in a way that if you're at just above a beginner level, but not quite at like an expert level understanding, that they're explained well. So that's going to be my goals if I continue making these Flask videos, is explaining them in just above a beginner level way of understanding. So we're not going to go over all the basics of coding or all the basics of Python. We'll just go over how to actually utilize these tools in order to think about building some sort of a web server. So if you like this video, let me know. If you didn't and you prefer Unreal Engine videos, let me know. I want to go back and make another Unreal Engine video next week. And if that ends up working out, maybe I'll trade off every other week. But let me know what you think. Let me know if this is helpful, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks.